This is the Interested Interview, and I'm your host, JJ Clark. And today I'm going to be talking about skill acquisition. And to help me with that task is Dr. Philip Kearney. He is a lecturer at UL in motor skill acquisition, coaching and performance, and course director of MSc Applied Sports Coaching. Philip, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
What's been your professional and academic focus?
So I began as an undergrad student in sport and exercise sciences. Within that, I developed an interest most of all within skill acquisition, which is just one particular area of sports sciences. And I was particularly interested in how that related to children's fundamental movement skills. So I was fortunate enough to do a PhD in fundamental movement skills at the University of Limerick. That took me over to the United Kingdom, where I taught for 8 years at a university on the south coast, University of Chichester, dealing with sport and exercise science, sport and exercise psychology, and various master's programs as well. And then in 2017, returned to the University of Limerick to take up a lecturing position there in skill acquisition. And I have been there since, mostly looking after the Masters in Applied Sports Coaching, but also engaging in a range of other activities around skill acquisition. So I would be co-founder of an organisation called Movement and Skill Acquisition Ireland, which is trying to promote sports science, awareness of sports science, and how it can be of assistance to instructors, to coaches, to physical education teachers, in terms of enhancing participation in sport at all levels.
If we investigate skill acquisition there, why is it important to develop human motor behaviour over a lifespan? Like, not just in a sports context. You mentioned teaching with children. Why is it important?
So, very simply, because of the health benefits of physical activity, both the physical and mental health benefits. People like to engage in activities that they are good at, and having a basic level of movement competence gives you the confidence and the motivation to engage in sport, in exercise, in outdoor adventurous activities, in physical activity in all its forms. There's a tremendous cost associated with inactivity, both to the individual and to society. So it's really important that everyone has every opportunity to engage in physical activity in a form that's appropriate for them. And that might be dancing or hill walking or the more traditional sport and exercise. There are lots of barriers to participating in physical activity, but basic movement competence is one barrier that we can remove through high-quality physical education or high-quality coaching or instruction.
Because it's an area of study, there should be common features of skill acquisition across the board. And what are they?
Yeah, so there's a couple of core principles in skill acquisition. And these core principles are really helpful for understanding how you can apply this regardless of what domain that you're looking at. So one of the core principles is that some of the ways in which people practice can artificially boost your performance. They can make you look like you're learning lots, you're doing really well inside in practice. But then when you come back at the next training session, or you try and go and produce this in a game or at a recital, suddenly the performance level is much lower. So the core principle in skill acquisition is the difference between performance and learning. So performance is how well you're doing in the moment, but learning, if we want to assess how much someone's learned, we need to assess how much you've retained, how much you keep after a break, or how much you carry over into a game or a performance context. And there are many different ways of practicing which artificially boost your performance. They make you look as though you're doing really well, but it's because the practice has been set up in a very simplified way. Maybe you're getting lots of repetition on a task and there aren't many changes, or maybe a coach or an instructor is giving you lots and lots of feedback. And these ways of structuring practice, most of the time, only lead to short-term boosts in practice, but don't help your learning. And actually, designing practice sessions which are a little bit messier, a little bit more chaotic, a little bit more challenging, where we see more errors, and most importantly, when learners are forced to think, these kind of practices, they might not look as though you're learning as much, but you retain more of that information. When it comes to the game, when it comes to the recital, when it comes to the next training session, you've retained more of the performance benefits that you
can you give an example of that? Like, what are the activities that are repeatable but not beneficial in the performance sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So one very good rule of thumb is that you want as much as possible the exercises that you are practicing to look like the exercises that you're going to be performing in the game or in track and field, in the race or in the jumps competition. That doesn't mean that there isn't ever a need to do some more isolated activities or breaking down the activity into parts. Sometimes that's very appropriate. But that's only appropriate some of the time. Most of your practice, more of your practice, needs to be mimicking the competition situation as much as possible. And even when you do break it down to specifics, so if we think about running drills, sprint drills is something that is used not just in track and field, but across a whole range of different sports now. A lot of the time when people are practicing sprint drills, they tend to practice the same drill over and over several times and then move to the next drill and practice that over and over several times. But when you're practicing in that way, it's very easy for the mind to switch off, to go into neutral and to just go through the motion. Whereas if you set up that activity where you're constantly switching from one drill to the next, now the brain has to think. Now you have to be engaged with the task. And that constant switching leads to enhanced learning. It is something that we found, again, across multiple different domains.
Can we go into deliberate practice? And does deliberate practice, does it have the same components? Is it a mental challenge, or is it... this might be a misconception of mine, but I have a conception that it's exerting yourself, as like training like you play. Is that accurate?
Training like you play is certainly an important part of deliberate practice. So deliberate practice is a term that was introduced by a Swedish psychologist called Anders Ericsson, who sadly passed away last year. Anders began by studying basic memory tasks, and he then progressed to looking at increasingly complex real-world tasks, such as learning music and sport. And so his work is really applicable to coaches and instructors. Traditionally, scientists had spent a lot of time examining novices and how they learned. But Anders Ericsson started to study experts and tried to identify exactly what it was that made them different. And one of the things he found was that experts practice differently. And he called that deliberate practice. So once you've mastered the basics of a task, just performing that task again, whether it's driving or playing through a piece of music or practicing a sports skill, that doesn't lead to much improvement. I suspect that everyone can identify a relative who has years of experience driving but hasn't gotten any better at it despite all that experience. All too often, practice can be reduced to just going through the motion. Deliberate practice is a very particular type of practice. It has a very specific goal. The learner, in cooperation with a coach or mentor, has identified the most important factor limiting his or her performance, and has then designed very specific practice exercises to address that limiting factor. So if we think about a golfer, for instance, a golfer may have worked out that their putting is an issue. It's something that's holding them back from progressing. But it's not just their putting, it's their control of length on putts between, let's say, 6 and 10 feet. So it's about identifying the really specific issue that's holding back your performance improvement. And once you've identified that issue, it's designing really specific exercises. So our golfer, in cooperation with their coach, would develop exercises that target, okay, how do I improve my control of length on putts of that length? And really importantly, those exercises provide feedback, not just on how well you're performing the task, but also on what is causing any change in performance, what was causing the problem, the missed putt, and what is now responsible for you being successful. So deliberate practice is highly focused practice that zones in on the most important work-ons for an athlete or musician or indeed on any task. It is practice that is supported by an experienced coach or instructor who helps to diagnose the error, design the exercise that's going to address this error, and provides feedback. And you're absolutely right. It is tough. It it is mentally demanding. And one of the characteristics of experts that Ericsson found was not just that they engaged in this very specific type of practice, this deliberate practice, but they were also distinguished by the fact that they could motivate themselves to continue to engage in such demanding training.
How long does it take to acquire expertise in a physical action?
So there's a number of different parts to this. The first depends on the complexity of the action, obviously, and when we define expertise, we also sometimes talk about, are we talking about world-level expertise in something like soccer, which is incredibly popular and there's a huge number of people playing, and therefore the standard is incredibly high, or are we talking about a more niche area? And oftentimes when people talk about, how long does it take to acquire expertise, the number 10,000 comes up, and there's a 10,000-hour rule. And again, there's a number of different parts to this. So is it 10,000 hours that's required to achieve expertise is one part of the question. And the second part is whether is it possible that anyone who puts in 10,000 hours can achieve expert status. Now, there's no doubt that if you want to achieve expertise in most disciplines in sport or chess or music, it requires an enormous investment of time. Ericsson did speak about 10 years of or 10,000 hours of practice as an example. And that was popularized by books like Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell and Bounce by Matthew Said. And I have a lot of time for those books. They didn't get everything right, but they did get a conversation started about skill acquisition. So back to this 10,000 hours idea. But what Ericsson concluded was that expertise required an enormous amount of a very particular type of practice, deliberate practice. The amount of practice was not the key point. The key point was that only quality practice matters. If you want to continue to progress to master sport skill or parallel parking, then it's the amount of quality practice that you invest that is most important. And the highest quality practice is called deliberate practice. The second part of Ericsson's contention, and the one that's a bit more disputed, is that deliberate practice is all that matters in terms of achieving expertise. If you want to play soccer at the highest level or to achieve grandmaster status in chess, as long as you invest in enough deliberate practice, you will get there. As long as you've got enough motivation, enough time, enough access to coaches who can guide that practice, and so forth. Now, that's very difficult to try and prove. The general consensus is that deliberate practice is not enough. Some people are born with cognitive or physiological or physical advantages that also make a profound contribution. And so it'll change how much deliberate practice somebody needs in order to achieve expertise. The work that is most convincing for me on this is by a researcher called Fernand Gobet, who investigated the current chess world champion Magnus Carlsen. But I guess to be honest, asking whether deliberate practice is all that matters actually misses the most important point for me. We know that many athletes don't engage in deliberate practice. Paul Kilgannon has a really nice book recently, and in that, footballer Gary Sice talked about how his practice has evolved. He now practices in a much more sophisticated way than when he started out. We know that athletes can be taught to engage in deliberate practice. So Dr. Ed Collin from Munster Technological University has published some really nice studies, including some in Gaelic football, showing how you can teach people to engage in deliberate practice and the benefits that has for their learning. So for me, Anders Ericsson's greatest legacy is that he's demonstrated that anybody can accelerate their learning by changing how you practice. And I guess for me, that's more important than trying to say how quickly can you attain the skill. That one depends on lots of individual factors. But what's really important is that we can teach anybody to practice more effectively and to accelerate their development.
It strikes me as that feedback loop that needs to be there is contingent on a coach or some external person looking at the activity that you're doing and saying, you could do this better or you could do this better. Could you go into that role and how essential it is in skill acquisition?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of points to this. There's a psychologist called Ellen Winner, and she introduced a phrase which I really like. It's called the rage to master. So one of the things that separates those individuals who go on to high performance is that they've got this really strong inner drive. And it might be really specific to the aspect of sport or music or whatever the domain is that they're working in. But they do have this really strong inner drive. But of course, the other aspect is that, and as I said, many people who are engaging in practice don't engage in very sophisticated practice behaviors. And any secondary school teacher will tell you this as well. There are many students that they see in their classrooms who don't engage in very sophisticated study habits, study behaviors. And again, this idea about deliberate practice applies just as much to studying as it does to sport. And we can learn to study better. We can learn to practice better. So it's really important, because people tend not to engage in very sophisticated practice without help. It's really important that you have coaches, that you have teachers who understand what high quality practice looks like and can teach individuals not just the content, but also how to learn, how to practice, most importantly. And if you haven't got that access to a teacher who is shaping your practice habits or your study habits, then you can spend an awful lot of time engaged in very inefficient practice.
Is there an optimum, I suppose, communication style or way to communicate? For example, with your athletes, what do you find works in terms of communicating? That's not the best way to, get the most out of yourself in this domain.
So again, I will say that as every teacher, as every coach will readily recognize, there is no one single best way of communicating with all athletes. This is something that is highly individual. And what I would say is really important for a coach or teacher to understand is that, number one, they have many different methods available to them. They've got lots of tools in their toolbox, if you like. And they might not know at the start what's the best way to communicate with any one athlete, but they're confident that they've got a range of approaches that they can use, and that it might take a little bit of tinkering, trying different tools out, but they will eventually find the right tool for the right individual to make that connection and to ensure that they learn. So that's part one. And very important to understand there are many different approaches to this. The second part that I think is really important, and that is forgotten sometimes, is that the athlete, the student, the player, if they want the feedback, if they want to learn, then your job is so much easier. And therefore, it's important sometimes for a coach to take a step back. Maybe you've identified a piece of feedback that you think player needs, but do they want it? Are they ready to listen? If they're not ready to listen to you at this moment in time, then rather than spending your time trying to give them feedback they don't want, spend your time making them want the feedback. What can you do to excite them, to open their eyes, to go, oh, I want to learn more about that? Because, again, it comes back to this idea of rage to master. If you can awaken the desire to learn within the athlete, it just makes the whole learning journey so much more effective.
I'm interested as well because I've seen it a good bit in my own, this is anecdote, but in my own experience in sport is that people will look for feedback, but as a ways to sort of check the box and seem, eager. I've seen it in work settings as well. Have you seen this in your study, and how do you account for it? Because it seems like that would trick the researchers or the person in the coach role.
So there certainly is an aspect of ticking the box or trying to be perceived, to be looking for feedback, or to be perceived to be engaged. That's something that you can see from time to time. What's really important is that you see people acting upon the feedback, and for coaches and teachers that they are obviously concerned with providing good feedback, but that they're also watching for, waiting for, planning for, how am I going to see that this individual is acting on the feedback, is actually taking some steps to develop themselves in light of the feedback. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is, and again, this is equally anecdotal, but I had a conversation with a coach of a world record holding swimmer at one point, and he talked about the difference that was obvious in this particular swimmer when she was a young teenager. And so I was really curious about this, and I asked him, well, what was that difference? What was it that you saw in this swimmer that was different to all the others that made her stand out? And he said she asked different questions. So not just ticking the box questions, but she was repeatedly looking for feedback and coming back to him saying, I've tried that. Did that look better? Was that what you were looking for? And so that repeated engagement and asking more questions and different questions and better questions over time, I think, is one of the key characteristics that you want your athletes to develop. You want your more senior athletes to be role modeling so that the younger athletes understand, if you want to learn, if you really want to accelerate your learning, this is how you practice, how you engage with the coach in order to make real differences.
What about environment design? What about, for example, a person who wants to acquire a new skill or a new behaviour? And what kind of environment design, or if any, do you try to coach into your players?
That's a really good question. Absolutely right that, really skillful coaches, really sophisticated coaches try to set up an environment that does a lot of the teaching for them, makes it easier for them to get their key messages across and to help their athletes to develop. And there are lots of different characteristics of these really effective environments. I remember attending a talk given by Brother Colin O'Connell, who's the coach to David Rudisha and many other outstanding Kenyan distance athletes, middle distance athletes. And he described a training group where everybody from 14-year-olds attending the school to Olympic champions were training in the one environment. And the 14-year-olds were learning from the 16-year-olds, the 16-year-olds were learning from the 18-year-olds, and so on. So we call that proximal role models. Role models who are close enough to you to think, yeah, they're ahead of me, but I could be like them. And a Danish psychologist called Christopher Henriksson has studied environments that are famous for producing expert athletes, from Danish sailing to Vecchio Athletics Club in Sweden. And he has also studied environments that are not so successful. And he's tried to identify what are the common features of these environments which lead to effective learning, which lead to most effective learning, which lead to optimal talent development. And so one of these is that there's the presence of proximal role models. Athletes are willing to engage with each other and pass on their knowledge, and that's overseen by a coach to ensure that it is good practices that are being passed on. But there are other features of these environments. So one is that it's a community, and it feels like a community. People have supportive relationships, of friendships within the group, which transcend performance level and which are important regardless of participation in sport. Another feature is that there's coordination and communication between the sport, school, family, and other commitments. Athletes aren't being pulled in different directions. The coach works with the athletes and the other stakeholders to ensure that the athletes are all being supported in everything that they're looking to do. And it's a balanced support. It supports their sporting goals, but also recognizes that they have other interests and they're supported and fostered to develop. those other interests. There's a big focus in these environments on holistic development of individual members. So what are the life skills that they are developing, which will help them in their athletic performance? So for instance, if we think about visualization or imagery, that's a skill which is often very useful to enhance your athletic performance, but can also be applied to enhance your development in areas outside of athletics and sport. And again, there's features like these environments give you opportunities to take initiative. So, the athlete's voice can be heard in shaping what training is like and what the group is like. That's certainly a feature of these effective environments. And that they're really focused on the long-term process. So it's not about early results. It's not about short-term performance. It's about, building the skills that will be helpful to you in 5-10 years' time when you're at your peak. Not rushing athletes back from injury, but giving them appropriate time to heal. So I've mentioned loads of different characteristics there, but I think Christopher Henriksen's work has done a really nice job in outlining that, building effective environments is a really important role for a coach if he or she wants to make or to be more effective in achieving their goals.
You mentioned visualization, and I suppose how core that is in the performance aspect. Why is it? Is it because you get to run through the actions before they've happened, and that sort of, I suppose, it sets your brain up for, these are the pathways that are going to be used, you're going to be ready, you're anticipating. It's almost like a dream, where prehistorically speaking, we would have dreams of taking down an elephant and you'd be able to assess, or a mammoth, and you'd be able to assess what are the best ways, what are the worst ways.
Yes, I think you've captured the essence of it there. It's a means of rehearsing. It's a means of preparing yourself. It's a means of gaining experience in situations where maybe it's difficult to gain experience. But visualization can prime you to perform well in these situations. And what I think is really important is that visualization is a skill for both the athlete and the coach or the instructor. So just as you talked about running through a session or running through a scenario for the athlete and unpacking it and how that can help them to prepare, absolutely. But the same applies to a coach. So running through a session in their mind, imagining different events happening or not happening, and how will they react, how will they deal with those situations, that's a really valuable part of planning sessions for a coach. It can be a really valuable part of reflection, thinking back over sessions for a coach. And taking the time and using imagery to really run through the scenario again, that's a really powerful way of gaining the maximum learning out of every experience that we have. So I would encourage, within my sport of athletics, for instance, within a training session, rest is very important. There's inevitably going to be some hanging around while the athlete recovers and gets ready to go again. So I would encourage athletes to use imagery during that period to help them understand what we're working on, to help them accelerate their learning, sometimes to build confidence, sometimes to help kind of transfer to competition settings. So they're imagining, even though we're down on the side of the track and it's a quiet evening session, they're imagining that this is the big competition setting to prepare them for that. But also, I'm encouraging them to use imagery in the athletic domain to develop their general skill at imagery, which can also be used outside of athletics. My colleagues here at the University of Limerick, Adam Toten and Mark Campbell and others, recently published a review of research, once again affirming just how effective imagery can be for accelerating learning. So it's certainly a tool that I recommend both for athletes and for coaches as well.
And pragmatically speaking, how does that look? When I think visualization, I think sitting in a chair. It's almost like a meditative behaviour where you're sitting, you're closing your eyes, you're taking maybe half an hour, 20 minutes. Is that what it's like, or is visualization in track and field different?
So I'll take a step back and I'll say visualization is a skill. So the more you practice it, the better you get at it, and the more you're able to utilize it in different situations. Traditionally, I think many people would share your view of visualization. It's something that you do sitting in a chair or lying in your bed and rehearsing different events that are upcoming. And that is certainly one way in which you can use visualization, and it has been shown to be effective in that way. But it's not the only way in which it can be used. And some of my own research has looked at how when we integrate visualization into the gaps between practice trials, how this can accelerate learning. And there's a number of reasons we think that it's responsible for this. But I would encourage athletes, yes, by all means, to image in separate imagery sessions, but also, and it connects back to this idea of deliberate practice, by integrating imagery into the every trial that you attempt, it's elevating the quality of those practice trials because it helps you clarify what you're working on. It helps you maintain your focus. It helps you review the practice trial that you've just completed. So imagery is one of the tools that we can introduce within a practice session, integrated into the physical practice trials to enhance the quality of the practice.
So in your downtime at the side of the track on, a quiet Tuesday, you're actively thinking about the environment of the big day and, or your turn or how you're going from third place to second place in a move around the corner. You're actively thinking about it just during that downtime between reps.
So I'll give you two specific examples. So one, an athlete who felt lots and lots of nerves ahead of competition, and this was quite debilitating actually. So they're getting too aroused. The adrenaline was up too high in the call room before going out to race, and therefore they were a little bit flat in the actual race itself because the adrenaline was already spent to an extent. So imagery was used with that athlete to help them prepare for the start of competitions, to manage their arousal levels pre-competition. So when they were doing their warm-up, they wouldn't just do the regular warm-up. They would imagine that they were warming up for a race. They would imagine the crowd, imagine the noises, imagine the competitors running beside them. They could see the faces of their regular competitors as they were walking back along the track beside them. And they would try and bring up the feelings. So in the pit of the stomach, they would feel the nervousness. They'd feel the energy associated with the competition. And once they had imaged those feelings, then they could practice their strategies to control their arousal levels, to manage themselves in the run-up to the start of the race. And so that's one way in which imagery can be used, where you're using it in competition or in practice to stimulate competition so that you can practice responding to competition scenarios. And then, as you said right at the very start when you introduced the idea of imagery or visualization, when you get to the competition, it's familiar to you because you've dealt with these feelings many, many times before. Because any athlete will train an awful lot more than they will actually race. So that's one way that we can use it. But the other way that I think imagery is really important is that it helps accelerate skill learning. So if we're working on long jump, for instance, and your coach has asked you to work on a particular action, so maybe after you take off, your coach wants you to hold this very tall, long position for a little bit longer. Well, then before going down and attempting that run up and jump again, and attempting to get into and hold that position, you can play it through in your mind a couple of times. See, what's it like when I manage to hold that position? What's that feeling that I'm looking for? So you've got 2 or 3 mental reps before you do your physical reps. And therefore, over the course of a session, you'll do the same number of physical reps, but you've also added on top of that many, many mental repetitions. And those mental repetitions, again, we know accelerates learning of skill.
That's fascinating. And I mean, you mentioned one of your studies there. I want to look at another of your studies, your study on excelling at youth level and how being a star under 13 athlete or youth athlete doesn't necessarily indicate a prodigious future for that athlete. Can you go into that a little bit and just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So in that study, we looked at 11 years data in the United Kingdom, tracking the performances of athletes from under 13 through to under 20. And we used the UK's national ranking system to do this. We wanted to see what the relationship was between the performances at different age grades. And so we ended up looking at over 130,000 performances, so a really substantial amount of data. And in summary, a minority of athletes retained their top 20 ranking. We used the top 20 as our kind of indication of the top level. In fact, only 13% of athletes who were ranked in the top 20 at under 13 were also ranked in the top 20 at under 20. And the big jump to senior level was still to come. So Dr. Parla Drew has done some excellent research in recent years documenting the difficulties associated with making the junior to senior transition. But we'd already shown that actually the vast majority of athletes who are top performers at 12 years of age were not top performers at 19. And in fact, from under 13 to under 15, so only 2 years, only 36% of athletes who were top ranked at 12 years of age were also top ranked at 14 only 2 years later. Now, we also looked at the inverse of that. What did top senior athletes look like when they were 12 years of age? And so we found about 10% of top seniors were top ranked at 12 years of age too. Another 10% or so were listed on the database, but they were outside of the top 20 ranking. And that means that 80% were not even listed. They were either not yet competing in athletics, or they had not yet achieved the minimum standards to appear in the national ranking. So our results show pretty conclusively that youth success tells you very little about the potential for later success. Of course, there are examples of athletes who are winning all the way through the age grade. But I think this is the key point. That's not a typical story for high-performance athletes. Yes, it's one pathway that athletes can take through youth sport, but there are many other pathways that athletes can take to senior success, as Diane Huxley's excellent research on Australian track and field athletes shows. And some athletes bypass youth success altogether. You only need to look at Sinead Divers, who's running for Australia at the moment, Irish-born, no history of youth success at all, but one of the top performers in the world in the marathon. So the message for coaches, for parents, for athletes themselves, administrators, is really to downplay youth success, and certainly not to invest on the basis of what you see on the track at age 12. Now, we looked at track and field athletics, but there's similar research in soccer and volleyball and martial arts and multiple other sports, all showing the same thing. Athletes develop along a myriad of trajectories, and early success tells you very little about future achievement.
And just with that, it's like puzzling to me, because you think surely if someone's been doing something longer, but I suppose the people outside that 10% or 20%, they're incrementally getting better and better and better, but it strikes me that people that peak or are in the top 20 runners, for example, listed are at the age of 18. That would hold some kind of predictive quality, but that people that are champions at the age of 12, it might be attributable to burnout, or people who are that driven at that age might flush out of the sport very quickly. It's just puzzling as to where it comes from, that people get better and better and better. You would think that time is the indicator of things.
That's a couple of very good points there in terms of what you said. I guess I'll start with burnout, which you mentioned. And I think that's certainly a concern. And there's some really nice work just come out of the US, and a group of researchers, Waldron and colleagues, who've shown that too much focus on a single sport and too much focus on intensive training early can lead to burnout, can lead to a range of negative psychosocial implications. So things like the reduced motivation to participate in sport. So Excessive specialization, too intensive training too soon, I think that's very definitely something that we need to be very wary of. But there's another important difference, which is around maturation, the differences in maturation between young people. So if we think about physical maturation, you can have 3 boys and they're all aged 12 years of age. But one of them looks like a 10-year-old and one of them could pass for a 14-year-old, even though they're all the same chronological age. They've all got closely the same birthday. And that's not unusual to see within an athletics club or on a basketball team or whichever sport you're looking at. Some people mature faster. They reach their adult size earlier. Now, there is research that shows that actually there's no difference in the eventual adult size. So early maturers and late maturers, they end up in the same place, but the timing at which they grow is different. And these differences in the timing of maturation and the timing of growth, these are most pronounced in early adolescence. And that makes a big difference across many, many sports. There's one athletics academy that published data on their athletes. And they found that 98% of athletes within this high-performance academy, adolescent athletes, in the jumps, sprints, throws, and combined events, were early maturers. That is, their skeletons were consistent with children at least 1 year older than their chronological age. So we know that early physical maturation makes a huge difference to how well people perform and the success that they achieve at youth level. But it's important to remember that it's not just physical. There's psychological, there's social differences as well in maturation. Sometimes athletes are ready to invest in intensive training at 15, 16 years of age, and they bring a professionalism to their training. For others, it might be 18, 19 years of age. For others, a little bit later still. And you can't control when the passion awakens in athletes and they're ready to invest. So coaches really need to leave the door open and to give as many athletes the opportunity to find their passion. And once they find their passion, then you can respond to that. But I think it's really important not to read too much into the early success for all these reasons.
How much of that early wins in sport dictates your later trajectory?
So there are certain sports, things like tennis, where there's an awful lot of recognition and avenues that are opened to you on account of relatively early success that are denied to other people. So it might be the case that people maybe get a foot in the door, and I think it's called the Matthew effect, that those who have a little get benefits because of that little initial advantage, and it continues to grow and grow and grow. So very small initial differences can produce quite big differences down the line. So there is, a little bit that some people who are picked up early or who are given a little bit extra attention early will get an advantage because of that. However, there's some really interesting research showing that actually there's a reversal effect as well. So some individuals who don't get that early attention, who still have a little bit of support from appropriate coaches or parents or peer groups, they have to work a little bit harder. They have to develop other skills. Maybe physically they're not able to compete, so technically or tactically they develop a little bit better, or psychologically they develop skills to be able to cope with setbacks and so forth. Whereas a lot of individuals that had this early advantage, there isn't the same push on them to develop as a well-rounded athlete or to develop the psychological skills that will also help them through their development. And so 5, 6, 7 years down the line, research in, again, a range of different sports has consistently shown that individuals who struggled a little bit early on have developed skills which allow them to overtake those individuals that seemed to have an initial piece of an advantage. It is, as with everything in terms of human behavior and human development, it's a very complex area. But certainly it makes you, or it reinforces the point that we cannot read too much into early success, and we need to think about how do we provide holistic development opportunities for as many people as possible within the youth sport environment.
On that note, we'll leave it there. Dr. Philip Kearney, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation.